We are going to tackle law and ethics, but first let's start with law. Now, it's true that all mass comm majors have to take a media law course, but usually that's later as you're a junior or a senior. So we try to fit a little bit of law and ethics into each of our classes because these are important concepts as you move through the program. So what is the difference between law and ethics? Well, I like the Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility. Right? So you've got to know about the laws that govern what you do and also about the ethics. So laws are legislated and then they are honed by courts, by lower courts and Supreme Courts. So laws are things that you can be punished for either criminally on the side when there's a law that's a criminal act or in a civil court for violating a specific law. Ethics are not as set as that, so ethics are more about societal norms. And specifically for our discussion, professional standards, and organizations have professional standards, as do all of our mass comm professions. So the First Amendment has 5 freedoms, and we talk about this as being the basis for law in the media and in the mass comm profession. So can you name all of the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment? Just a hint, the right to bear arms is not a part of the First Amendment. Sometimes students get confused. Actually, all kinds of people get confused, not just students. But here are the freedoms. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. So it's freedom to practice religion. No law abridging the freedom of speech. So freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to peaceably assemble, and then one that we sometimes forget, but also the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. So you get to tell the government and hold them accountable. So one of the very important concepts in law in the First Amendment, though, is who or what is prohibited from infringing on your freedom. So we all have these 5 freedoms, but what does that mean? Who can't stop us from these things, right? And so really what it comes down to is it's the government, right? So the government can't shut you up, tell you what you can't print or tell you what you can't say, et cetera, but your boss can. So private entities can control speech with respect to employment and such, but the government cannot. So when you work for the government, that's a little different, but in general, that's the way this works. So that might beg the question of, if you recall, our PR professional who posted that reprehensible tweet that was racist when she got on her flight, and then later when she got off her flight found out she had been fired. Why could she be fired for that? Well, it's because the government didn't fire her, right? So she was legally liable for all the information she posts. We are responsible for what we post or publish. So libel, there is defamation, which is a part of libel, and you'll get more into that as you get to media law. But in essence, it's not illegal for her to say that, right? The government can't come and do anything to her, or the government can't shut down her account, but her employer is free to fire her for violating their standards of ethics. And so, you can basically, the court of public opinion can get after you, and your boss, those sorts of things. So the government can't shut you up, but your boss can. Let's look at this. So this is the right to protest, right? The right to peaceably protest. But there are lines that are drawn. So a peaceful protest is one thing, but then obviously police can come in and say that this was not peaceful and that there was violence. And of course that also there's a lot of debate that goes on with that. But just so you know, there are limits as drawn by the law and by courts. If you're interested in the concept of the media and free press and libel, this is a really good documentary that won a lot of awards. It's on Netflix, and so I've posted the trailer for you online if you want to check that out. So let's talk about libel. So this is the sort of most common concept in media law, and it's the thing that affects all of us. So libel requires 3 things. The publication, so it's got to be published, which means either broadcast or online or print in any of these forms, social media, everything. That constitutes publication. The information has to be false, so the publication of a falsity that causes injury to someone's reputation. So you would just have to prove that you were injured by the information that came out that was false, and it's actually very easy to prove you were injured. So libel is written or broadcast. Slander is spoken. So sometimes you'll hear that concept And that's just like spoken into a room, right? But if it's published, even if it's broadcast spoken, that's still libel. If it's not true, right? So truth is a defense, but if the information is false, then it potentially is libelous, and that's a determination a court makes. But if it isn't false, then it can't be libelous. Doesn't matter how much it injures your reputation if it's true. Even if you don't name someone, this is where it can be tricky, and of course much more on this in media law, but even if you don't name someone, if you use so much information that it is easy to determine who that person is, and all of these other things apply, then that can get you in trouble. So if you said somebody running this marathon was, pick a crime, right? Someone running this marathon had embezzled $1 million, you wouldn't be able to identify the person by that information. But if I said a 21-year-old mass comm student who was a journalism major in the online 1313 section in the summer did something, that's pretty specific. So it might be easy to tell who that is. Not that you did any of that stuff. So is this libel, right? Pope Francis shocks the world when he endorses Trump for president and releases a statement. Now we know this wasn't true, right? So this concept and, fake news, right? So it's not true. So could the Pope sue whoever published this content? And of course the Pope could sue. And there's a lot of information to show this information isn't true. But the question is, could he sue? Potentially. But there's this concept of public figure. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. But let's look at all of these different kinds of publications. So like CNN and crazy news like Weekly World News, and campus media and your website that we produce for class, and advertising and social media. So which of these are protected by the First Amendment? And which of these can be held accountable for libel? Well, in essence, everything is protected by the First Amendment. There are some differences when we talk about advertising, because while there is First Amendment protection to a degree, the FTC does regulate advertising, and so that falls into a little different category. And so deception is illegal. And so there are some things that you've got to have truth in advertising according to federal law, and that has been found to be acceptable because that information is being paid to produce that. For everything else, all of this is protected by the First Amendment, but also you've got the responsibility to be sure you're not committing libel, because you can be held accountable even in our class website. So you're responsible from the time you post or publish the information, right? So that means that if you violate copyright, if you libel somebody, you are held liable, you are responsible from the moment you publish information. So whether it's on our class website or in your own personal social media, you are accountable if something is not accurate. So the main law with respect to libel is Times v. Sullivan. And there's this concept that's pretty basic and important. It's called actual malice. And this is because actual malice says knowing information was false and not bothering to check it out, right? So having a reckless disregard for the truth. But it doesn't say that something you can't make a mistake, right? So we know, especially in the world of journalism, sometimes mistakes are made. And if some information is false, so it is published and it is false, and the person it was written about is a public figure or public official, it is sometimes acceptable for it to be false as long as you did everything you were supposed to do as part of your job and the standards and ethics of your profession. If you did all of those things and still you didn't determine it was false, you didn't knowingly publish something that was false, then you can't be held liable. And the reason for that is because if we were so afraid to report on a government official or a public figure, an athlete or a star, if we were so afraid that if we got something little wrong and then we would be sued for millions of dollars, we would never be able to print information. And the courts have determined that the public good is better served by giving the media the right to responsibly do their job, knowing that sometimes there will be mistakes. So who is a public figure? The governor, who is not Rick Perry right now, right? So he was the governor. So even though he's no longer the governor, still a public figure. The current governor, of course, too. Most musicians are public figures. Pope Francis is a public figure. Denise Trouth is a public figure, president of a big university. The courts have decided that law officers are all public figures. So even though any law officer, you may not know this person, and they may not be a famous law officer, the fact that they have the right to take your freedom away puts them in the realm of being a public figure. So journalists have to have the freedom and ability to write about law enforcement without fear of being sued every time they turn around. Pro athletes, everybody who kind of lives in that realm of being well known. What about professors? What about me? Professors, it depends, right? So it depends on whether or not the professor has gotten famous, right? So if the person is out there and is speaking all of the time before big groups and has a Nobel Prize, then probably yes. Just, somebody you encounter in your regular classes, probably not. There's also the concept of, this is the Las Vegas shooter, right? So the concept of, yes, he is a public figure, but for a limited purpose. So the fact that somebody becomes a public figure because they're put in the limelight, they may be a public figure for a limited amount of time. And courts are the ones that determine whether or not these things are true. There's also a part of the law, the Communications Decency Act, which basically protects website owners from libel suits based on comments. So you are, if you are publishing content, you are responsible for the content you publish, but if you accept comments on your section, you are not held liable or not responsible for the content of those comments. Now, you're not held legally responsible, but of course, many organizations choose to monitor their comments because they want a civil discourse, and that is different. And it is perfectly okay for you to decide the person who commented cannot say that on your website, and you are free to take that down. That person doesn't have a First Amendment right to say anything on your website. So the best defense, again, is truth and fact-checking when it comes to libel, that concept of whether or not you get something wrong. So another little area of law that I'll just mention is in advertising, this concept of appropriation. Right? So appropriation means taking someone's name or photo or their words and using it to endorse or sell a product without their permission. Right? So without their permission. So if this supermodel hadn't given permission for her image to be used, or this guy, who's actually a Texas State grad, by the way, he was a broadcast major, you see him in a lot of things, if they hadn't given their permission for this ad, then GoDaddy would be guilty of appropriation. But it also means that you can't just use somebody's image in an ad, right? So fair use does not apply to commercial work, and we'll talk about fair use. But you cannot just appropriate somebody's image. So is this illegal? Well, if you're using this as a poster to advertise your party, then yes, it is illegal. Now, of course, we see these things all the time, but you can't use someone's image, you can't appropriate that to advertise. It's also probably a copyright, problem because you don't own the copyright to that image. And again, we'll talk about copyright as well. So appropriation. There's a few more areas that are good to study that are in the textbook: privilege, hyperbole, opinion. So much goes into media law that, of course, there is an entire course, and it will affect you throughout your career, regardless of which mass comm profession you're in. But that's all we will talk about today in this lesson.